The police sirens shattered the perfect suburban silence at exactly 3:15 on a Tuesday afternoon. I watched from my living room window as two patrol cars pulled up to my house, their red and blue lights painting my white picket fence in alternating colors of chaos. Linda from the HOA stood on my front lawn, clipboard in hand, pointing dramatically at my driveway where my wife's black sedan sat parked. She was gesturing wildly to the officers, her voice carrying across the manicured lawns as she demanded they arrest us for the heinous crime of parking on our own property. I felt my stomach drop as I realized how far Linda had pushed this insane parking dispute. But what Linda did not know, what she could never have imagined in her wildest power-drunk fantasies, was exactly who she had been harassing for the past 6 months. That was when my wife Sarah stepped outside and reached for her wallet. 6 months earlier, Sarah and I thought we had found paradise. Willowbrook Estates looked like something straight out of a home and garden magazine. Every lawn was perfectly manicured. Every mailbox painted the exact same shade of forest green. Every driveway swept clean of even the smallest leaf. The houses stood in perfect rows like soldiers at attention. White picket fences lined the sidewalks where children rode their bikes in the golden afternoon light. It was everything we had dreamed of when we decided to leave the chaos of city life behind. Linda Morrison appeared at our front door within hours of the moving truck's arrival. She stood there with a plate of chocolate chip cookies and the brightest smile I had ever seen. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect waves, her pink sweater looked like it had just come from the dry cleaner, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who owned the entire neighborhood. "Welcome to Willowbrook Estates," she said, extending the cookies toward me. "I am Linda, your HOA president. I just wanted to stop by and let you know how excited we are to have you join our little community." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her sharp blue eyes scanning our half-unpacked boxes and furniture. "You have made an excellent choice moving here. We pride ourselves on maintaining the highest standards of community living." Sarah emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Linda's smile widened as she extended her hand. "And you must be the lovely wife I heard about. What kind of work do you do, dear?" "Government consulting," Sarah replied with her usual calm professionalism. She had this way of speaking that somehow managed to be both friendly and completely unreadable at the same time. Linda nodded approvingly. "How wonderful! We love having professional people in our community. Now, I brought you a copy of our community guidelines." She produced a thick binder from seemingly nowhere. Just some basic rules to help everyone maintain our beautiful neighborhood standards. I flipped through the binder that evening. 47 pages of regulations covering everything from approved paint colors to the exact height grass was allowed to grow. There were rules about garbage can placement, holiday decorations, and even the types of flowers allowed in front yard gardens. "This is pretty intense," I said to Sarah as we sat on our new couch surrounded by moving boxes. Sarah looked up from her laptop where she was reviewing some work documents. "It is what we signed up for. As long as we follow the rules, everything should be fine." For the first month, everything was fine. We settled into our new routine, got to know a few neighbors, and started to feel like we actually belonged in this picture-perfect community. Then the first violation notice arrived. I found it tucked under my windshield wiper on a Thursday morning. The official HOA letterhead made it look like a legal document. "Violation notice. Garbage receptacle placed at curb 14 hours before designated pickup time. Fine, $50. I stared at the paper in disbelief. I had put the garbage out Wednesday evening instead of Thursday morning, 14 hours early. $50 for putting the trash out one evening too early, I asked Sarah at breakfast. She looked at the notice with the same analytical expression she used for everything else. Pay it and make sure we follow the exact schedule next time. I paid the fine, but something about that official letterhead and Linda's overly helpful smile was starting to feel less like community standards and more like something else entirely. The violations started coming faster after that first garbage can incident. A notice about our mailbox being the wrong shade of forest green. Another about our grass being half an inch too tall. A third about the decorative plant Sarah had placed near our front steps not being on the approved list. Each notice carried a $50 fine and Linda's signature at the bottom, written in the same precise handwriting that somehow managed to look both official and condescending at the same time. I tried calling Linda to discuss the violations. She answered on the first ring, her voice sickeningly sweet. "Oh, hello there, neighbor. What can I do for you?" "Linda, I wanted to talk about these violation notices. Some of them seem a bit excessive." Her tone shifted instantly, like flipping a switch from warm to Arctic. Excessive. These are community standards that everyone agreed to when they purchased their homes. Standards that keep our property values high and our neighborhood beautiful. But charging $50 because our grass was half an inch too tall seems. The regulations clearly state that grass height cannot exceed 2½ inches. Your grass was 3 inches. That is a violation, period. I tried a different approach. "Linda, could we maybe discuss a warning system for first-time violations, just to help new residents adjust to?" "The rules are the rules," she cut me off. "If you wanted to live somewhere without standards, you should have chosen a different neighborhood." The line went dead. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things I had missed before. The way other neighbors seemed to hurry past Linda when she was out on her daily neighborhood patrols. The forced smiles when she stopped to chat. The quick glances they would throw toward their own properties, as if checking for potential violations. Mrs. Chen from 2 houses down approached me one Saturday morning while I was washing my car. "How are you adjusting to the neighborhood?" she asked, but her voice carried an odd tension. "It is taking some getting used to," I admitted. "These HOA rules are pretty strict." Mrs. Chen looked around nervously before stepping closer. "Linda gave us 8 violation notices in our first 6 months here. 8. For things like having our newspaper delivered to the wrong side of the driveway and hanging our Christmas lights 2 days before the approved date." "That seems extreme." Last month, she fined the Johnsons because their 10-year-old son left his bicycle on their front lawn overnight, said it violated the community aesthetic standards. Mrs. Chen shook her head. "We all thought moving here would be peaceful. Instead, we live in fear of that woman and her clipboard." As Mrs. Chen walked away, I started paying closer attention to Linda's daily routine. Every morning at exactly 8:30, she would emerge from her house with her clipboard and camera, walking the neighborhood streets like a general inspecting troops. She would stop at random houses, take photos, make notes, and sometimes even pull out a measuring tape. But I also noticed something else. Certain houses seemed to be immune to her scrutiny. The Hendersons next door to Linda had grass that was clearly longer than ours, but they never got violation notices. Mr. Patterson down the street had a mailbox that was obviously the wrong color, but Linda would walk right past it. "I think Linda is targeting us specifically," I told Sarah one evening as we watched her patrol the street from our living room window. Sarah looked up from the case files she was reviewing, What makes you think that? Look at the Hendersons' grass. Look at Patterson's mailbox. They are worse than anything we have been cited for, but they never get violation notices. Sarah stood and walked to the window, studying Linda's movements with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for her work. She is documenting everything about our property. Photos, measurements, notes. But she is walking past obvious violations at other houses. So what do? We follow the rules perfectly and document everything she does. If she wants to play games, we will make sure we are prepared. That was when Linda shifted her focus to our driveway. It started with her taking photos of our cars. Then she began measuring the distance between our vehicles and the property line. Within a week, she was spending at least 20 minutes every morning standing at the edge of our driveway, clipboard in hand, studying our parking arrangement like she was planning a military operation. The first parking violation notice arrived on a Monday. Violation notice: vehicle parked in driveway in violation of community aesthetic standards. Fine, $75. I read the notice 3 times. We were parked in our own driveway, completely within our property lines, not blocking any sidewalks or streets. But according to Linda's interpretation of the community guidelines, our parking arrangement was somehow a violation of neighborhood standards. Sarah read the notice with her usual calm expression, but I could see something shifting behind her eyes. Something that looked a lot like a predator calculating the best approach to deal with a threat. "This is harassment," I said. "Yes," Sarah replied quietly, "it is." Linda's obsession with our driveway became the focal point of her entire existence. Every morning, she would position herself at the edge of our property with the dedication of a surveillance expert. She carried a camera, a measuring tape, a notebook, and her ever-present clipboard. She would take photos from multiple angles, document the exact position of our vehicles, and measure distances between our cars and various property markers. It was like watching someone build a case for the crime of the century, except the crime was parking legally on our own property. The violation notices started arriving weekly, then daily. Each one carried increasingly ridiculous justifications and higher fines: $75 for improper vehicle spacing, $100 for aesthetic disruption of community standards, $150 for repeated violations of driveway usage guidelines. I spent hours reading through the HOA bylaws, searching for any actual regulation that supported Linda's claims. The community guidelines mentioned maintaining aesthetic standards and keeping driveways clean, but there was nothing about vehicle positioning or spacing requirements. "Linda, this is getting out of hand," I confronted her one morning as she stood in front of our house with her camera. "We are parked legally on our own property." She looked up from her measurements with the cold efficiency of a tax auditor. The community guidelines clearly state that all residents must maintain aesthetic standards that preserve property values and neighborhood appearance. Where exactly does it say anything about how cars should be positioned in driveways? Section 12, subsection 4, paragraph 3. All residents must maintain their properties in a manner consistent with community aesthetic standards as determined by the HOA board. That is completely vague. You are interpreting that to mean whatever you want it to mean. Linda's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I am the HOA president. Interpreting community standards is exactly my job. And if we refuse to pay these ridiculous fines, then you will face more serious consequences: legal action, liens against your property, possible forced compliance measures." Sarah had been watching this conversation from our front porch, and I could see her analyzing every word Linda spoke. When Linda walked away, Sarah approached me with the kind of measured calm that usually meant she was planning something. "She is operating completely outside her actual authority," Sarah said. "HOA boards cannot create arbitrary rules and retroactively enforce them with fines. So what do? We document everything. Every interaction, every violation notice, every threat she makes, and we wait for her to overplay her hand." Linda's demands became more outrageous with each passing day. She wanted us to park only in our garage. When we explained that our garage was currently being used for storage while we finished unpacking, she suggested we rent a storage unit. When we refused, she proposed that we park our cars on the street instead of in our driveway. "The street?" I asked during another morning confrontation. "You want us to park on the street instead of our own driveway?" "Community aesthetics are more important than individual convenience," Linda replied with the tone of someone reciting religious doctrine. "Linda, that makes no sense. Parking on the street would create actual problems, blocking traffic, taking up spaces other neighbors need." "That is not my concern. My concern is maintaining the standards that make this community special." Sarah joined the conversation, her voice carrying a subtle authority that I had learned to recognize from her work calls. "Linda, can you show me the specific regulation that requires residents to park in their garages instead of their driveways?" Linda bristled at being questioned. "I do not need to justify community standards to residents who clearly have no respect for neighborhood values." "Actually, you do need to justify them," Sarah continued calmly. "HOA boards are required to base enforcement actions on clearly written regulations, not personal interpretations or arbitrary standards." "Are you threatening me?" "I am asking you to provide the legal basis for your enforcement actions." Linda's face flushed red with anger. "You want legal basis? Fine. You have until Friday to comply with proper driveway usage standards, or I will take this matter to the authorities. The police will be very interested to hear about residents who think they are above community law." As Linda stormed away, Sarah watched her with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for studying crime scene evidence. "She just made a very big mistake," Sarah said quietly. "What do you mean?" "She just threatened to involve law enforcement in a civil HOA matter. She is about to discover exactly how much authority she actually has." That evening, Sarah spent hours on her laptop, making phone calls and reviewing documents with the kind of methodical precision she brought to all her professional work. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Research," she replied without looking up. "If Linda wants to involve the police, we need to be ready for exactly what that is going to look like." I had no idea that Sarah was preparing for much more than just a simple police visit. She was preparing to end Linda's reign of terror once and for all. Friday morning arrived with the kind of perfect suburban stillness that made everything feel deceptively peaceful. Sarah had left for work early, her black sedan parked in our driveway in exactly the same position it occupied every day. I was working from home, reviewing quarterly reports on my laptop when the doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see Linda standing on our porch with two police officers flanking her like bodyguards. She held her clipboard against her chest like a shield, and her expression carried the righteous satisfaction of someone who believed justice was finally being served. I opened the door to find myself face to face with Officer Martinez and Officer Thompson, both of whom looked like they would rather be anywhere else in the world. "Good morning, sir," Officer Martinez said with the weary tone of someone who had been dragged into neighborhood drama against their better judgment. We received a complaint about illegal parking on this property. Linda stepped forward before I could respond. Officers, this resident has been repeatedly violating community parking standards despite multiple warnings and official violation notices. They refuse to comply with HOA regulations and are creating a public nuisance. Officer Thompson looked at our driveway, then back at Linda with obvious confusion. Ma'am, the vehicles appear to be parked on private property within the property lines. That is not the point, Linda snapped. This is a community with standards, standards that everyone agreed to follow when they purchased their homes. These people think they are above the rules that everyone else follows. I watched the officers exchange a glance that clearly said they were beginning to understand what kind of situation they had been dragged into. Sir, Officer Martinez addressed me. Are these your vehicles? Yes, officer. Both cars belong to my wife and me. We live here. And you are parked on your own property? Yes, completely within our property lines, not blocking any sidewalks or streets. Officer Thompson consulted his notepad. Ma'am, what exactly is the nature of the complaint? The vehicles appear to be legally parked on private property. Linda's voice rose with indignation. The nature of the complaint is that these people are willfully violating community standards. They have received numerous violation notices and fines, and they refuse to comply with proper parking procedures. What proper parking procedures? Officer Martinez asked. Community aesthetics require that vehicles be parked in garages, not displayed in driveways like some kind of used car lot. Both officers looked at our two cars sitting quietly in our driveway, then back at Linda with expressions that suggested they were trying very hard to maintain their professional composure. Ma'am, Officer Thompson said carefully, HOA parking disputes are civil matters, not criminal issues. We cannot enforce HOA regulations unless there is an actual violation of city or state law. There is a violation. They are creating a public nuisance by refusing to follow community standards. Ma'am, parking legally on private property is not a public nuisance. That was when I heard Sarah's car pulling into the driveway. I watched through the window as she parked in exactly the same spot she used every day, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment observing the scene on our front porch. Linda's face lit up with vindictive satisfaction. Perfect timing. Here she is now, flagrantly violating parking standards right in front of you officers. Sarah stepped out of her car with the calm confidence she carried everywhere. She was wearing her usual professional attire, dark blazer, crisp white shirt, and the kind of posture that somehow managed to command attention without demanding it. Officers, she said as she approached the porch, I am Sarah. I live here with my husband. Is there some kind of problem? Linda jumped in before the officers could respond. The problem is that you people think you are above the law. You have been repeatedly violating community parking standards, ignoring official violation notices, and now you are parking illegally right in front of police officers. Sarah listened to Linda's rant with the kind of patient attention she might give to a suspect during interrogation. When Linda finished, Sarah turned to the officers. Officers, what specific law are we accused of violating? Officer Martinez cleared his throat. Ma'am, we were called about a parking complaint, but honestly, we cannot see any violation of city or state parking regulations. That is because there is not one, Sarah replied calmly. This is an HOA civil dispute, not a criminal matter. Linda's voice reached a pitch that probably alarmed dogs in neighboring counties. This is not just a civil dispute. This is about law and order. This is about people following the rules. These people think they can do whatever they want. Sarah reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her wallet. Officers, before this goes any further, I think there is something you should know. The moment her wallet appeared, I could see both officers tense slightly. In their line of work, someone reaching for identification during a dispute usually meant the situation was about to change dramatically. Linda continued her tirade, completely oblivious to what was about to happen. I demand that you arrest them for willful violation of community standards and public nuisance. I demand that you impound these illegally parked vehicles. Sarah opened her wallet and calmly presented her credentials to Officer Martinez. The effect was immediate and electric. Officer Martinez looked at Sarah's credentials, and his entire demeanor shifted like someone had just told him he was standing next to the president. His posture straightened, his expression became instantly more respectful, and he actually took a small step back. "Ma'am," he said in a completely different tone of voice, "I apologize. We were not aware of your position." Officer Thompson leaned over to see the credentials, and his reaction was identical. Both officers were now treating Sarah with the kind of professional respect reserved for fellow law enforcement, especially federal law enforcement. Linda, still completely oblivious to what had just happened, continued her dramatic performance. "I do not care what kind of government consulting job she has. That does not give her the right to ignore community standards." Sarah closed her wallet and addressed the officers with calm authority. "Officers, I am FBI Commander Sarah Chen. I work out of the regional field office downtown. This woman has been harassing my family for months with fraudulent violation notices and threats of legal action for parking legally on our own property." The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop on the neighboring lawn. Linda's mouth was hanging open like she had just been told the world was flat. The officers looked like they were trying to process how they had ended up in the middle of a dispute between an HOA president and an FBI commander. "FBI," Linda whispered, her voice suddenly small and uncertain. "Yes," Sarah replied with the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout months of harassment. "I am a 20-year veteran of federal law enforcement. I specialize in investigating fraud, harassment, and abuse of authority." Officer Martinez found his voice first. "Commander Chen, how would you like us to proceed with this situation?" Linda suddenly seemed to realize that her entire world had just shifted beneath her feet. Wait. This cannot be right. You said you worked in government consulting." "I do work for the government," Sarah replied, "consulting on federal criminal investigations." The color drained from Linda's face as the implications began to sink in. For 6 months, she had been systematically harassing, threatening, and attempting to intimidate a federal law enforcement officer. The same federal law enforcement officer who specialized in investigating exactly the kind of behavior Linda had been engaging in. But you never said. You never told anyone you were FBI." "I am not required to announce my profession to neighbors," Sarah said calmly. "And it certainly does not change the fact that you have been issuing fraudulent fines and making threats based on non-existent regulations." Officer Thompson stepped forward. "Commander, do you want to file a formal complaint about the harassment?" Linda's panic was now visible to everyone. "Harassment? This is not harassment. This is community standards enforcement. I am the HOA president. I have authority." Sarah turned to address Linda directly for the first time since the credentials were revealed. You have very limited authority under HOA bylaws. You do not have authority to create arbitrary regulations, issue fines for non-existent violations, or threaten legal action for activities that are completely legal. I was just doing my job. Your job is to enforce clearly written community regulations, not to create new rules based on your personal preferences. Officer Martinez consulted his notepad. Commander, from our perspective, there is clearly no criminal violation here. This appears to be a civil HOA matter. That is correct, Sarah agreed. However, when HOA officials abuse their authority, make threats, and issue fraudulent fines, it can cross the line into criminal harassment. Linda looked like she was about to faint. Criminal harassment, but I am just trying to maintain community standards. By targeting specific residents with arbitrary enforcement while ignoring identical situations at other properties, Sarah asked. By issuing fines based on regulations that do not exist, by threatening police action for legal activities. The officers were now looking at Linda with the kind of professional skepticism usually reserved for suspects who had been caught in obvious lies. Ma'am, Officer Thompson addressed Linda, you called us to report illegal parking, but these vehicles are clearly parked legally on private property. Did you misrepresent the situation when you called? Linda's confident authority had completely evaporated. She stood there clutching her clipboard like it might somehow restore her power, but the game had changed completely. She was no longer the neighborhood authority figure dealing with difficult residents. She was a civilian who had just spent months harassing a federal law enforcement officer. I was just trying to maintain standards. Standards that apparently do not apply to other residents with identical parking situations, Sarah asked. That is different. How is it different? Linda had no answer. For the first time in months, she was faced with someone who actually understood authority, law enforcement, and the proper procedures for handling disputes. Someone who could not be intimidated by threats or impressed by her self-appointed position of power. Officer Martinez closed his notepad. Commander Chen, we will file a report noting that no criminal violations were observed and that this appears to be a civil HOA dispute. Is there anything else you need from us? Not at this time, Sarah replied. Thank you for responding to the call. As the officers walked back to their patrol cars, Linda stood frozen on our front porch, still trying to process what had just happened. The woman who had spent months wielding her clipboard like a weapon now looked like someone who had just realized she had brought a water gun to a tank battle. Sarah turned to Linda with the kind of calm professionalism that somehow felt more intimidating than any amount of yelling could have been. Linda, we need to have a conversation about how this harassment campaign is going to end. Word traveled through Willowbrook Estates with the speed of wildfire in drought season. By evening, every neighbor within a 6-block radius knew that Linda Morrison had spent months harassing an FBI commander over parking violations. The story grew more dramatic with each telling, but the core facts remained unchanged. Our quiet neighbor who worked in government consulting was actually a federal law enforcement officer, and Linda had picked the worst possible target for her power trip. Mrs. Chen called within an hour of the police visit. Is it true? She asked breathlessly. Is your wife really FBI? Yes, I confirmed. She is FBI Commander Sarah Chen. Oh my God. Linda has been harassing an FBI agent for months. The phone did not stop ringing. Neighbors who had barely spoken to us suddenly wanted to share their own horror stories about Linda's enforcement tactics. The Johnsons called to tell us about their 10-year-old son being cited for leaving his bicycle on their lawn. The Patterson family described violation notices for having the wrong color mailbox. The Martinez family had been fined for hanging Christmas lights 2 days before the approved date. Each story followed the same pattern: arbitrary enforcement, ridiculous fines, and threats of legal action for activities that were completely normal. Linda had been running Willowbrook Estates like her personal kingdom, using fear and intimidation to control behavior that had nothing to do with actual community standards. Sarah spent that evening documenting everything. She had photographs of Linda's daily surveillance routine, copies of all the violation notices we had received, recordings of Linda's threats about police involvement, and detailed notes about her discriminatory enforcement patterns. "This is actually a textbook case of abuse of authority," Sarah explained as she organized the evidence. "Selective enforcement, arbitrary rule creation, threats of false police reports, and systematic harassment of specific targets." What happens now? Now Linda discovers what actual consequences look like. The next morning brought a steady stream of visitors to our front door. Neighbors who had been living in fear of Linda's clipboard suddenly felt brave enough to speak up. They brought their own collections of violation notices, photos of Linda's surveillance activities, and stories of harassment that painted a clear picture of systematic abuse. Mr. Patterson showed up with a folder containing 17 violation notices he had received in 8 months. 17. For things like having my newspaper delivered to the wrong side of my driveway and my grass being 2 inches instead of 2.5 inches. Mrs. Henderson brought photos she had secretly taken of Linda measuring her flower beds with a ruler. She spent 45 minutes documenting the exact spacing between my tulips. 45 minutes. The Wilson family arrived with violation notices totaling over $800 in fines for infractions that included parking their car at the wrong angle, in their driveway, and having their trash can visible from the street for more than the approved time frame. Sarah reviewed each case with the methodical precision she brought to federal investigations. She photographed every document, recorded every statement, and built a comprehensive file that demonstrated a clear pattern of harassment and abuse of authority. "This goes way beyond HOA overreach," she told me as we reviewed the evidence. "This is systematic targeting and intimidation of residents through fraudulent enforcement actions." Word of the evidence collection reached Linda by afternoon. She appeared at our door looking desperate and angry, her usual perfect appearance replaced by the frazzled look of someone whose world was collapsing. "You cannot do this," she demanded. "You cannot turn the entire neighborhood against me." Sarah answered the door with her usual calm professionalism. "Linda, I am not turning anyone against you. I am simply documenting the harassment campaign you have been running against multiple residents." "Harassment campaign? I am enforcing community standards." "You are selectively targeting specific residents with arbitrary fines while ignoring identical violations by your friends and allies. That is not community standards enforcement. That is personal harassment." "I am the HOA president. I have authority." "You have limited authority under clearly defined regulations. You do not have authority to create new rules, issue fraudulent fines, or threaten residents with false police reports." Linda's desperation was becoming more obvious with each exchange. "This is all because you are angry about parking violations. You are using your FBI position to intimidate me." "Linda, I have been documenting your behavior since the first fraudulent violation notice." This has nothing to do with intimidation and everything to do with systematic abuse of your position. That evening, Sarah received a call from the HOA board chairman. The conversation was brief and professional, but I could tell from Sarah's tone that Linda's support system was beginning to crumble. "The board wants to meet tomorrow evening," Sarah told me after hanging up. "They are calling an emergency session to discuss recent complaints about HOA enforcement practices." "What kind of complaints?" "Apparently, 17 different residents have contacted board members since yesterday. They are all sharing stories about Linda's harassment and asking why the board has allowed it to continue." Linda's isolation became more apparent with each passing day. Neighbors who had once smiled nervously and hurried past her now ignored her completely. Her daily patrol routes were met with closed curtains and residents who suddenly had urgent business elsewhere. The woman who had ruled through fear and intimidation was discovering what life felt like when nobody was afraid of her anymore. Her clipboard no longer represented authority. Her violation notices were being questioned and challenged. Her threats of legal action were being met with demands for actual legal justification. The kingdom Linda had built through systematic harassment was collapsing, and she was finding out that kingdoms built on fear never survive contact with someone who actually understands how authority is supposed to work. Sarah had not destroyed Linda's power through intimidation or revenge. She had simply applied the same methodical approach she used in federal investigations: document everything, follow proper procedures, and let the evidence speak for itself. The house of cards was falling, and Linda was about to learn that natural consequences have a way of finding people who abuse whatever small amount of power they are given. The emergency HOA board meeting was held in the community center on a Thursday evening that felt more like a town hall uprising than a routine homeowners association gathering. 43 residents showed up, which was more than had attended any HOA meeting in the previous 5 years combined. Linda sat at the front table next to the 4 other board members, but her usual commanding presence had been replaced by the defensive posture of someone who knew they were about to face judgment. Her clipboard sat untouched in front of her, and she kept glancing nervously at the growing crowd of residents who had come to tell their stories. Sarah and I sat in the third row, surrounded by neighbors who had spent months living in fear of violation notices and arbitrary fines. The evidence we had collected was organized in a neat folder, but it turned out we would not need most of it. The residents themselves were ready to provide all the testimony necessary. Board Chairman Robert Stevens called the meeting to order and announced that they were there to address concerns about recent enforcement practices. What followed was 2 hours of testimony that painted a clear picture of systematic harassment and abuse of authority. Mrs. Chen described 8 violation notices in 6 months for infractions that included having her newspaper delivered 15 minutes before the approved time. The Johnson family recounted being fined because their 10-year-old son left his bicycle on their front lawn overnight. The Patterson family brought 17 violation notices totaling over $1,000 in fines for activities like parking at the wrong angle in their own driveway. Each story followed the same pattern: arbitrary enforcement, ridiculous fines, and threats of legal action for completely normal activities. Linda had been operating like a dictator with a clipboard, creating rules that existed nowhere in the actual HOA bylaws, and enforcing them selectively against residents she wanted to control. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she approached the microphone with the calm authority that had made Linda's harassment campaign look so ridiculous in retrospect. "I am FBI Commander Sarah Chen," she began, and the room fell completely silent. For the past 6 months, I have been the target of systematic harassment by HOA President Linda Morrison. I have documented over 30 fraudulent violation notices, recorded threats of false police reports, and witnessed discriminatory enforcement practices that violate both HOA bylaws and basic principles of fair treatment. She presented her evidence methodically, showing photographs of Linda's surveillance activities, copies of violation notices for non-existent infractions, and documentation of selective enforcement patterns that proved Linda was targeting specific residents while ignoring identical violations by her allies. This is not community standards enforcement, Sarah concluded. This is abuse of authority, harassment, and systematic intimidation of residents who have done nothing wrong. The board members looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs. It was clear that they had been aware of Linda's aggressive enforcement style, but had never realized the extent of her harassment campaign or the legal implications of allowing it to continue. Linda attempted to defend herself, but her arguments sounded increasingly desperate and hollow. She claimed she was maintaining community standards, but residents immediately provided examples of her selective enforcement. She insisted her actions were justified by HOA regulations, but board members confirmed that many of her cited violations were not supported by actual bylaws. The vote to remove Linda from her position as HOA president was unanimous, 4-0, with Linda herself abstaining after realizing that even her own board members would not support her continued leadership. The new HOA president, elected immediately after Linda's removal, was Mrs. Patterson, a retired school principal who promised reasonable enforcement of actual regulations rather than arbitrary rule creation and selective targeting. Her first act was to void all outstanding fines issued under Linda's administration and establish a clear appeals process for any future violations. Her second act,